The room had no windows, but it still managed to feel exposed. Thomas Yazzie sat stiffly in the worn leather chair, his calloused hands resting on his knees. Across the long table, his two older brothers lounged like men certain of their reward. Bennett tapped a glossy pen against the polished surface gold ring glinting on his finger. Chester, always the quieter one, scrolled through his phone eyes, occasionally flicking toward the attorney, who read from a thick folder with the voice of a man who had done this too many times. To my son, Bennett Yazzie, the attorney began, I leave the family transport business, Yazzie and Sons Hauling, including all commercial trucks, maintenance equipment, and the Chinley depot lot. Thomas heard the flick of Bennett's pen stop. To Chester Yazzie, the attorney continued, I leave the Page property, including its lease rights, the tool shed, and all investment accounts associated with Yazzie ranching. Thomas stared at the grain of the table. His stomach clenched, but he held his breath. His daughter Ayanna, just 14, sat beside him, quiet as moonlight. Her small fingers wrapped around the hem of his faded denim sleeve. And to my youngest son, Thomas Yazzie, the attorney said, his voice faltering only slightly, I leave my personal tackle box and fishing gear currently located in the back shed. A silence so thick it pressed against the walls followed. Then Bennett exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound between a chuckle and a scoff. Well, hell. Guess Dad figured Tommy'd finally have time to go fishing. Chester laughed. Is that the busted orange one he used to drag around to Wheatfields Lake? I thought he'd tossed that old garbage out years ago. Thomas didn't move. His chest felt hollow, scraped clean. It wasn't the lack of money. He had lived without it long enough to stop expecting any. But it was the final stamp of what his father believed about him. The shame of being the poor son who'd stayed behind, raising a daughter alone after her mother died, working side jobs instead of wearing boots with clean heels. The attorney cleared his throat. The tackle box is available for pickup at your convenience. The garage code is included in your folder. Thomas reached for the papers without looking up. His hands trembled as he slid them into his satchel. Ayanna leaned into him, voice barely above a whisper. You okay, Dad? I'm all right, he said, but the words caught like gravel in his throat. Bennett stood and stretched. You sure, little brother? You can take some of the scrap metal from the shed too if you want. Chester and I are going to be a little busy dealing with real assets. Chester joined him at the door. Better tie that tackle box down on the drive home. Wouldn't want it flying off your truck bed. The door closed behind them with a hiss. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The attorney avoided eye contact. I'm sorry, Mr. Yazzie. Your father's instructions were clear. They always were, Thomas said. He stood slowly, spine aching from tension. Come on, Ayanna. They stepped out into the bright Arizona afternoon. The heat slapped them like truth. Thomas's battered Ford sat wedged between Bennett's chrome-plated truck and Chester's new model Escalade. His daughter climbed in silently. He started the engine, its familiar rattle grounding him. Halfway down the gravel drive, Ayanna turned to him. Why would Grandpa do that? He didn't answer right away. Dust curled behind them, the silence between them dry and thick. He used to take you fishing, right? She asked. Thomas nodded once. Then maybe the tackle box means something. He gripped the wheel tighter. He left your uncle's land, trucks, bank accounts. He left you something personal, something worthless, he said bitterly. Ayanna didn't argue. She just looked down at her notebook, her sketch of their family's old cornfield in the margins. She didn't draw the house behind it. It had been too small, too broken to bother with lately. When they got back to the trailer, Thomas dropped the satchel on the table. Bills were spread across the counter like a game he never learned how to win: electricity, propane, Ayana's school fees. He stared at them, then at the coffee tin that held the last $67 they had between them. His pride had long been worn thin, but today it felt like it had finally torn through. A knock came at the door. He opened it to see Ethel Begay standing with a casserole dish wrapped in foil and an arched eyebrow that said she already knew everything. "I brought dinner," she said. He opened the door wordlessly. Ayana brightened when she saw her. Ethel set the dish down and folded her arms. "You got that look again. What look? The one your daddy had the day he sold his favorite saddle to pay your school tuition." Thomas exhaled through his nose. She pulled out 2 plates and set them down like she lived there. "What did the old man leave you?" He almost laughed. "A tackle box." She raised her eyebrows. "You don't say." "And a pile of humiliation." She stirred the casserole. "You remember what he used to say about fishing?" Thomas sat down heavily. "He said it was where you went to remember who you were." Ethel handed him a plate. "Maybe that's what he's trying to tell you now." He stared at the steam rising from the food. The ache in his chest was heavier than hunger. Ayana spoke without looking up. "He said treasure wasn't always shiny. He told me that when I was little." Thomas looked over at her. "He told you that?" She nodded. "About his tackle box, said it had secrets." Thomas stood abruptly, heart pounding. "Where's that garage code?" Ayana was already reaching into the satchel. "Here." He took it with fingers that barely obeyed him. "We're going back tonight." "Right now?" she asked. "Yes." Why he didn't have the words, only a thundering in his chest that said something had been left unfinished. Something important. Ethel smiled faintly. "Now you're hearing it." He paused at the door. "Hearing what your father," she said, eyes shining, "telling you to look beneath the surface." They drove back as the sun dropped low over the red cliffs, casting long shadows that stretched across the road like memories. The tackle box was still there when they opened the garage, a dented rust-orange rectangle on the dusty shelf, almost invisible beside boxes marked tools and winter coats. Thomas reached for it. The metal was cool and heavier than he remembered. "Dad," Ayana whispered. "You think it's just hooks and bait?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know what it is." But as he held it in his arms, feeling the familiar weight of it, something shifted in him like a thread pulled loose after being tied too long. He carried it back to the truck, the sun disappearing behind the ridge, and for the first time that day, he felt the faintest pull of something other than shame. Something like a beginning. Some men inherit wealth. Others inherit memory, and memory is heavier. The tackle box sat between them on the kitchen table like a rusted animal, silent, hulking, unknowable. Thomas hadn't opened it yet, not even unlatched it. He'd driven back with it balanced on the passenger seat like sacred cargo. Ayana hadn't taken her eyes off it the entire ride. Not out of hope exactly, more like reverence, as if the thing might speak if they listened long enough. Outside, the desert night had swallowed the last of the orange light. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with the low hum of the refrigerator and the click of the ancient ceiling fan blades. The casserole Ethel brought sat half-eaten on the counter. Neither of them had touched it since returning. Thomas leaned his forearms on the table, studying the tackle box's dents, the peeling orange paint, the handle wrapped in cracked electrical tape. His father's initials, E.Y., were faintly scratched into the top corner. Eli Yazzie had taken this box on every trip to Navajo Lake, to the San Juan, even down to the Verde River that one summer when everything was going wrong. "How could this be all he left me?" Thomas murmured, more to himself than to her. Ayana was drawing in her notebook, not sketching so much as tracing something over and over, circles, lines, shadows, her brow furrowed. Maybe it's not all she said. Thomas glanced at her. I'm not expecting anything magical inside Ayana. You weren't expecting anything at the will either. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. His body ached in ways he couldn't blame on labor. It's just old line hooks, probably a few busted lures. Ayana kept tracing, but you haven't opened it. He looked back at the box. It hadn't been opened in at least a decade, maybe longer. The last time he'd seen his father use it was just before his mom passed. After that, the tackle box went to the shed, and his father, once the strongest man he knew, began shrinking in silence. He reached for the latches and stopped. We should get some rest. Tomorrow's a work day. I already finished my homework. I meant for me. She gave him a look that said she saw through him. Dad, you think he did this to hurt you? Thomas shook his head, though the truth wasn't that simple. I think he didn't see me the way he saw them. I think he thought I failed. But you didn't. Her voice was so steady, so sure. You raised me, you stayed. He swallowed hard. That doesn't count for much in a room full of attorneys and deeds. She closed her sketchbook. It does here. Thomas smiled barely. I know, baby girl. The knock came soft and slow, 2 taps, a pause, 1 more. Thomas stood and opened the door. Ethel Begay stepped inside without waiting. She held a basket this time, the smell of cedar and warm fry bread trailing in behind her. I brought breakfast for tomorrow, she said, setting the basket on the counter. Or for tonight if you're done pretending you're not starving. Thomas couldn't help the chuckle that slipped out. You're not subtle. You're not mysterious, she said. I saw the truck lights. Figured you brought it back. Her eyes landed on the tackle box. She walked toward it and stood still. That old thing, she murmured. He wouldn't let me touch it. Not once. Thomas joined her at the table. He always said it held everything he needed. Ethel nodded slowly. That was Eli. Carried more in silence than most folks do with their whole mouths open. Ayana asked. Do you think he meant for Dad to find something? Ethel turned to her. Child, I think that man's heart was layered like canyon stone. What he didn't say was often more important than what he did. She ran her fingers lightly over the lid, then stepped back. I won't tell you what's in there. But I'll tell you this, your father never did anything without a reason. Thomas nodded once. Thanks for the food. Ethel gave him a long look. You'll open it when it's time. After she left, they sat in silence again. Thomas stood, finally picked up the box, and carried it to the shelf in the bedroom closet. He set it there gently, like you would an urn or an old Bible. Ayana watched from the hallway. We're not going to open it. Not tonight. She didn't protest, just turned and went to her room. Thomas lay awake for a long time. The swamp cooler clunked softly through the thin walls. His thoughts flickered like the broken fanlight on the porch. Bright, then gone, then back again. He thought about all the days he'd stood next to his father on the shore, casting without speaking. How Eli would organize the tackle like a jeweler arranging gemstones. How he once told Thomas hooks catch fish, but patience keeps you fed. He thought about Ayana needing new shoes and about the overdue light bill. About how Chester had leaned into him after the will slapped his shoulder and said, "Least you got something sentimental, bro." Sentimental. He got up before dawn, made coffee in the battered metal pot, and sat on the porch watching the darkness lift off the land like a blanket being pulled back. At 6:10, Ayana emerged dressed and ready, hair braided backpack slung low. You're up early, he said. I heard you pacing. He handed her a tortilla wrapped in foil. Eat on the walk. She hesitated. Are you going to open it today? He nodded once. After I get home from the day job, we'll look together. She smiled and started down the steps, then paused. Maybe it's not just memory, you know. What is it then? Maybe it's a map. He tilted his head. To where, she shrugged, to wherever Grandpa thought we needed to go. When she disappeared down the road, the house felt too quiet. The tackle box still sat hidden in the closet, but its presence pulsed through the walls. Thomas cleaned up, shaved, and loaded up his tools for a fence repair job out by Lukachukai. As he drove, the early sun cut across the desert floor, stretching shadows far ahead. He didn't know what he'd find in that box, but he knew now he couldn't carry it unopened any longer. By sunset, he'd be home again, and this time he would lift the latches. A man doesn't hide treasure from the world, he hides it from those who wouldn't understand its worth. The door creaked open as Thomas stepped into the trailer, the desert dust still clinging to his boots. Sweat streaked his shirt. His knuckles were raw from fencing wire, and a sunburn had settled deep into his neck. The house was dim, the early evening light slanting through the blinds like golden slivers. It smelled of dried sage and the faint copper tang of dust. He didn't pause to wash up. He moved straight to the bedroom closet and pulled out the tackle box. Ayana appeared behind him in the hallway like a shadow come to life. You ready? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Thomas glanced at her, saw the way her hands were clenched into the hem of her shirt. He nodded. They brought it out to the living room floor and sat cross-legged on the worn rug. The latches gave a gritty protest, then snapped open. He raised the lid slowly. Inside, the expected spools of brittle fishing line, rust-flecked hooks, an old pocket knife with a missing rivet, and faded lures nestled in yellowing foam. It smelled like motor oil and riverbanks, like time itself had soaked into the metal. Ayana leaned closer. That's it. Thomas sifted through the contents. Each piece was familiar, he'd seen his father hold them, use them, repair them. But there was something strange about the bottom of the box. It didn't ring true when he tapped it. It felt deeper. He lifted out the foam lining and reached beneath. His fingers scraped metal. Then they found a lip. He pressed. A click. The false bottom shifted and lifted away. Inside was a thick envelope wrapped in waxed canvas. Beneath it, a tarnished key and a folded slip of paper with a name, Merle Chateau. Trust Manager. Farmington. Thomas picked up the envelope and turned it over in his hands before carefully sliding it open. A stack of papers spilled into his lap, certificates, land titles, bank documents. His breath caught. Ayana clutched his arm. What is it? He flipped through them, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Deeds for plots across New Mexico. Mineral rights. Stock holdings in a private trust fund. One paper stopped him cold. Eli Yazzie, irrevocable trust value, $245,000 Susan Solerson. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His heart hammered like a drum inside his chest. Ayana's voice broke through. Is that real? He looked at her, his mouth dry. If it is, we're sitting on a mountain. She leaned forward, staring at the documents like they might vanish. Why would Grandpa hide this? Thomas shook his head slowly. Because if Chester or Martin had found it first, it would have disappeared into a casino weekend before sundown. He picked up the key. It was old brass and stamped with a number 117. Safe deposit box, he murmured. Ayana asked, what if there's more? He stood still, dazed. We need to see this Merle Chateau. Tomorrow. But why keep it from everyone? Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared at the key in his palm, remembering his father's quiet eyes, the long silences, the way he would watch Thomas with something close to sorrow. A man like my father, he finally said, didn't trust easily. And what he did trust, he protected. He paused, thinking aloud now. Maybe this wasn't just about the money. Maybe it was about who'd use it right. Ayana's brow furrowed. Like, for the land or our people? Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe. Or maybe he just knew I'd think twice before blowing it all. The documents still lay spread across the rug like puzzle pieces. He sat back down and gathered them carefully, sorting them into stacks. A knock rattled the door. Thomas tensed. Ayana stood quickly and peeked through the blinds. "It's Martin," Thomas cursed under his breath and shoved the papers into the envelope. "Put it in your room," he whispered. "Now." She darted down the hall as Thomas opened the door. Martin Yazzie filled the frame, his build thicker, his face roughened by alcohol and entitlement. "Bro," he said too loud. "Ethel said you brought back that box." Thomas stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. "I did. It's just old fishing junk." Martin gave him a sidelong look. "That all, Dad didn't leave you anything else?" Thomas shrugged. "Didn't seem like it." Martin leaned in the stench of beer, sour in his breath. "You'd tell me if you found something else, right? I mean, we're brothers. Blood and all." Thomas forced a smile. "Course." Martin smirked. "All right, just making sure. You know, Chester still thinks Dad squirreled something away. Said maybe in the shed or buried out near Bitter Wash." Thomas kept his face neutral. Well, he always did love stories. Martin clapped him on the shoulder harder than necessary. "You're a good man, Tom. Not like some folks around here. You take care." He turned and stumbled back toward his truck. Thomas waited until the headlights disappeared down the road before going back inside. Ayana was waiting. "You think they suspect they know Dad was secretive. They just don't think he'd ever trust me with anything real." "But he did," she said. He met her eyes. He did. That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, the documents on his nightstand, like a living thing. The weight of them pressed on his chest, not just the dollar signs, but the responsibility, the meaning. He kept hearing his father's voice from long ago. Riches can bury a man just as easy as they can lift him. Morning came with the dry whistle of wind through the trailer vents. Thomas brewed coffee and sat on the porch, the key swinging from a shoelace around his neck. Ethel's truck pulled up just as the sun cracked the sky. She stepped out, hands on her hips, eyes narrowed. "You found something." He didn't pretend. "I did." She nodded once. "And now I go find out how deep it goes." She looked past him toward the rising sun. "You be careful, Thomas. Money calls to men louder than truth ever could." He sipped his coffee. "That's why I'm not going alone." Ayana stepped out behind him, dressed and ready, backpack slung over her shoulder. Ethel smiled. "Smart girl." Thomas opened the truck door for his daughter. As they pulled out, the tackle box still sat on the table, its contents stripped, its purpose revealed. But its weight had only just begun to settle. Sometimes it ain't the lock that keeps a man out, it's the fear of what he'll find behind it. The bank building sat squat and tan beneath the morning sun in Farmington, its adobe curves casting soft shadows across the sidewalk. The parking lot shimmered with heat already rising from the ground. Thomas parked the truck, his hands white-knuckled around the steering wheel. Ayana sat beside him, silent, her fingers gripping the envelope tightly in her lap. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "You good?" she asked. He glanced at her. You ever step into a place knowing you ain't never coming out the same? She smiled faintly. Like every time I've gone into one of Martin's barbecues. He huffed a dry laugh, and the moment cracked just enough for them to push forward. Inside, the cool air hit like a wave. The walls were lined with framed prints of mesas and blue sky meant to be soothing. But Thomas's stomach churned. At the reception desk, a woman with penciled eyebrows looked up from her monitor. "We're here to see Merle Chatto," Thomas said. "About a trust. My name's Thomas Yazzie." The woman blinked, then gave a small professional nod. "Please wait here. I'll let Mr. Chatto know." 10 minutes passed. Ayanna fidgeted, her eyes scanning the room like it might change. Finally, a man appeared, a short Diné elder with white braids and a bolo tie clasped with turquoise. His walk was slow but steady, his presence quiet and composed. He studied Thomas with an expression of careful recognition. "You're Eli's boy," he said. Thomas stood. "Yes, sir." Merle nodded. "Come with me." They followed him through a quiet corridor into a small office filled with the scent of leather and aged paper. Merle gestured to the chairs. "You brought the box, I brought what was inside." Thomas handed over the envelope, watching Merle with cautious eyes as he unfolded the documents. The old man's brows drew together as he read, his fingers tracing the trust certificate like he was reacquainting himself with a ghost. "I told Eli this would surface one day," Merle murmured. "Didn't think it would be you," Thomas swallowed. "Why did he hide it?" Merle leaned back. "Because wealth breaks families when the family's already broken. Eli never believed your brothers had the spine to carry the weight. And you, he said you'd suffer under it before you ever used it wrong." Ayanna looked between them. "What now?" Merle pulled open a drawer and took out a small book. Inside was a ledger, old school, handwritten. He flipped to a bookmarked page. "The safe deposit box is here in this building. The key 117 matches one he gave me 10 years ago just in case he didn't make it home." Thomas reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the key on its string. Merle stood. "Come. It's time." The walk to the vault was oddly silent. The bank's security guard met them and unlocked the first steel gate, then the second. The vault door hissed open, revealing rows of drawers like graves in a mausoleum. Merle moved directly to 117. "Open it." Thomas knelt, his heart pounding in his ears. He fitted the key and turned it. Click. The door opened with a reluctant creak. Inside was a wooden box wrapped in leather, heavier than it looked. He pulled it out and set it on the table in the center of the vault. He hesitated. "You came this far," Merle said gently. "Don't stop now." Thomas unwrapped it and lifted the lid. Stacks of old letters bound in twine. A sealed envelope marked, "To my son." A polished stone pendant, the kind worn only by medicine men. And a single manila folder with a title, "Reservation Redevelopment Plans." Confidential. He picked up the envelope and opened it. A letter in his father's handwriting. He began to read aloud. "Thomas, if you're holding this, you found what others never bothered to look for. Good. That means you've grown into the kind of man I hoped you'd be. This money isn't meant to buy you peace. It's meant to give you a weapon to protect the land, to fight for what's been stolen, and to build something better for your daughter and everyone else still out there, wondering if their lives matter. You'll find the plans. I worked on them with Merle and old Pete Begay before the cancer caught up to Pete. Use them wisely, and never forget where you come from, because if you do, all this will be dust. I love you, son, even if I never said it right. Dad." The room was still. Ayanna wiped her eyes. Merle cleared his throat. "Your father wasn't one for words, but when he did speak, he carved them deep." Thomas opened the folder next. The documents inside weren't just schematics or real estate outlines. They were blueprints for community centers, a cultural school, farming co-ops, water systems. Every line was drawn with care. Every plan etched with purpose. He wanted to rebuild the reservation, Ayanna whispered. Thomas nodded, staring at the paper like it had lit a fire in his chest. Merle stepped forward and laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Eli asked me to hold this until the right heart came looking. I believe that heart is yours. A knock echoed from the vault entrance. It was the bank manager, pale and sweating. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chatto, but there's someone outside. Two men asking loud questions about the Yazzie Trust. One said his name is Chester. Thomas stiffened. Ayanna whispered. How did they find out so fast? Merle's face darkened. Loose mouths, or someone saw the key? Thomas repacked the documents quickly, tucking the pendant into his pocket. We have to get out the back, Merle said. I'll cover the front. Outside, the sun had shifted, casting long lines across the street as Thomas and Ayanna slipped through the alley beside the bank. He didn't speak until they were back in the truck and pulling away. They're going to try and take it, she said. Let them try, he replied. They don't know what it's for. They wouldn't even understand. As they merged onto the highway, Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. No sign of Chester or Martin. Yet. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't just protecting an inheritance anymore. He was carrying his father's mission. And for the first time in years, the weight of that burden felt like something he was born to hold. People think land is just dirt. But to us, it's memory, blood, breath. And if they steal, that they steal everything. The wind cut through the high desert like it carried warnings, pushing grit across the windshield as Thomas turned off the main road and onto the old dirt path that led toward his father's hidden acreage. Every mile felt like he was driving deeper into a place memory had tried to bury. The red cliffs stood like watchmen, casting long shadows across the land, and the sagebrush bent low, as if bowing to something ancient beneath the soil. Ayanna sat beside him, quiet, her phone in her lap. She had called her uncle that morning, Pete Talachi, a retired land rights lawyer and Diné activist. He agreed to meet them at the old grazing land where Eli's proposed redevelopment project was supposed to begin. Still think this is crazy? Thomas asked, his knuckles tight on the wheel. I think this land's waited long enough, she replied, her eyes locked on the horizon. And you're the first one who's finally listening. When they reached the base of the low ridge, Pete was already there, leaning against an old Suburban that had seen better decades. His long braid was streaked with silver, and his eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his weather-worn hat. He looked like a man carved out of the rocks themselves. He waved them over and gestured to the hills behind him. This land your father marked, Pete said, shaking Thomas's hand firmly. But the boundaries go beyond what the eye sees. These arroyos, these water paths, they trace back to pre-treaty lines. And that folder you found, it doesn't just hold dreams, it holds evidence. He must have known that. Thomas pulled out the blueprint folder and the sealed map marked in his father's hand. Pete unfolded it slowly, his mouth tightening as he read the notations. Eli traced old grazing rights community claims and water sources the BIA ignored. If these records check out, it means some of this land was never legally ceded. You could challenge the current leases. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. Who holds them now? Pete tapped a spot on the map. Company called Red Mesa Holdings. Sounds local, but they're backed by an out-of-state developer. Oil, maybe lithium. They've already filed permits to drill test wells on the southern edge. Thomas's gut clenched. That's where the school's supposed to go. Pete folded the map again slowly. Then you've got a choice. File for injunction and risk lighting a legal firestorm, or work quietly and rally the community first. Ayanna crossed her arms. They'll come for him either way. Chester's already sniffing around, and Martin's not exactly subtle. Pete nodded. Then we better make sure when they come you're not standing alone. Thomas took a breath and looked out over the land, the way the hills rolled like sleeping giants, the cottonwoods growing thick near the seasonal creek bed. It's not about owning it, he said quietly. It's about protecting it. For her. For kids like her. Pete smiled faintly. You sound just like your old man. That night they drove back to the trailer park in silence, the kind of quiet that settles deep after you've been handed a burden bigger than yourself. Thomas parked behind his trailer, but something was off. The back gate was ajar. He motioned for Ayanna to stay in the truck. He moved slow, stepping lightly over the gravel. The screen door to the trailer hung loose on one hinge. Inside, drawers were yanked open. The few keepsakes he owned, his dad's old belt buckle, a photo of Anna in a carved frame, were scattered across the floor. He moved to the back room, where the trust documents had been stored in a locked box under the bed. The box was gone. Damn it, he whispered. He turned as Ayanna entered behind him, eyes wide. They were here, Chester Thomas said. Or Martin, maybe both. She walked over and picked up the shattered frame with Anna's picture, her mouth tightening. We can't stay here anymore. He nodded. Let's pack what we can. We leave tonight. Within an hour, they had what mattered: documents, clothes, a few heirlooms, and were back on the road heading toward Ayanna's aunt's house on the eastern edge of Shiprock. She owned a small feed store and an even smaller guest house. It was quiet, out of the way, and more importantly, trusted ground. On the porch, her aunt, a wiry woman named Nora with thick braids and hands rough from decades of hauling grain, hugged them both without question. You come here, you're safe, she said. But you better believe the fire's coming behind you. That night, Thomas sat alone on the back steps, staring at the stars above the sandstone buttes. The weight of it all pressed on him, his father's vision, the stolen trust, the broken lock, the knowledge that his brothers wouldn't stop until they buried the past and sold the future. He pulled the pendant from his pocket, the one from the safe deposit box, and ran his thumb along its smooth edge. It wasn't just decoration. It was a promise. A key not to a lock, but to a legacy. A door creaked. Ayanna joined him, 2 steaming mugs in hand. Couldn't sleep either. Too much in my head, he murmured. She handed him the mug. You're not alone in this, Thomas. He looked at her, eyes heavy. I feel like I'm trying to build something with wolves at the door. Then we need more than blueprints, she said. We need allies. People who remember what Eli stood for. People who'll fight for this land, not just with lawyers, but with heart. He nodded slowly, the thought beginning to form. There's still folks from the old days. People my dad trusted. Then we find them, she said. Before your brothers do. The wind picked up, stirring the dust in the yard. Thomas set down the mug, stood, and stared out into the desert. Then we start tomorrow, he said. Because if we don't claim this ground now, they'll salt it before the sun rises again. And beneath the blanket of stars, he felt the land, listening, waiting. They're not just trying to erase a name from a deed, they're trying to erase a man from memory. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Nora's guest house, painting streaks of orange across the faded wood floor. Thomas sat at the edge of the bed, boots half-laced, mind spinning faster than his hands could keep up. He hadn't slept much, maybe an hour or two, fitful and filled with broken dreams of his father shouting from beneath the earth. His voice muffled his hands, reaching for something Thomas couldn't see. In the kitchen, Ayana was already awake, her laptop open, and papers spread across the table like a battlefield. She had made coffee thick and black, just how his dad used to brew it when they went fishing before dawn. The scent alone brought a lump to his throat. Pete emailed last night, she said, without looking up. He found 2 elders who remember your dad filing those community grazing claims in the 90s. One of them even signed a witness affidavit. The Bureau ignored it back then. Thomas nodded, rubbing his eyes. That's good. It's something. She pushed a folder across the table toward him. It's more than something. It's evidence. We're building a case, Thomas, brick by brick. He opened the folder, scanning the scanned statements, the faded signatures, and a yellowed photo of his father standing beside a rusted boundary marker with 2 older men. The marker was painted red, white, and blue, ironically, the same colors as the corporate banner now hanging over Red Mesa Holdings' drill site. Ayana scrolled her screen. But here's the kicker. Martin's lawyer filed a claim with the county yesterday. He's trying to transfer temporary control of the estate to a holding company. If he succeeds, they can bulldoze the entire west acreage by the end of the week. Thomas's blood ran cold. They're not even pretending anymore. She looked at him. They don't have to. They think nobody's watching. He stood and grabbed his jacket. Then we give them a reason to feel eyes on their back. They drove to the community center, first a modest building near the reservation's edge with peeling turquoise paint and an old basketball hoop nailed above the front door. Inside, a group of elders sat in folding chairs, sipping weak coffee and speaking in low dinner. At the front of the room, Pete stood beside a table lined with maps and photocopies. As Thomas walked in, heads turned. Some nodded in recognition. Others whispered. Pete gestured to him. This is Thomas Yazzie, son of Eli. He's trying to protect what his father started. Thomas didn't know how to make speeches, but he remembered how his father used to speak, not loud, but steady, like the land was listening. They're not just trying to erase a name from a deed, Thomas said, voice rough. They're trying to erase a man from memory. But my father's memory isn't in the ink. It's in the water paths he fought to keep clean. It's in the fence lines he walked to keep cattle safe. It's in the quiet way he left seeds for something bigger. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with shared memory. One elder, a woman with long gray braids and a turquoise shawl, stood. I remember your father. He helped rebuild my corral after the flood in '98. Never asked for payment. Just said, we all live under the same sky. Another man added, he stopped the county from rerouting the water trench to my east field. Said even a dry creek still carries promise. Pete turned to Thomas. They'll stand behind you, but only if you lead. Thomas felt the weight of it settle over his shoulders like a second skin. Then let's file the injunction. Let's make them answer to us for once. By noon, Pete and Ayana were drawing up emergency motions while Thomas drove to the county clerk's office. As he stepped into the polished building, he noticed Martin's SUV parked at the far end of the lot, its custom plates shining under the sun. Inside, the clerk looked up as Thomas approached. I'm here to challenge a property filing made by Martin Yazzie on behalf of Red Mesa Holdings, he said. The woman blinked. Do you have legal counsel? Thomas set down the documents Pete had given him. Right here. And a notarized affidavit. We believe the trust is being mishandled and that ancestral land is at risk due to forged or misrepresented ownership transfers. She hesitated, scanning the first page. I'll need to get the county assessor. Please do, Thomas said. I'll wait. As she walked away, Thomas's phone buzzed. Ayana, they just pulled the old water rights files from the tribal archives, she said breathlessly. And guess what? Red Mesa's permits don't account for water access. They assumed it was unrestricted. But your father had filed seasonal water protections through the old range council. If we can get that documentation, they can't legally drill. Thomas exhaled hard. That's the wedge we needed. Pete's already on it. But Thomas, it's going to get ugly fast. Outside, he saw Martin walking toward the building, his stride too confident for a man who'd just been caught in a lie. He opened the door with a smirk, greeted the receptionist like an old friend, and then turned his gaze to Thomas. "Didn't expect to see you here," Martin said. "I live here," Thomas replied coolly. "Maybe you forgot. I heard you're stirring up some noise. That folder of Dad's shouldn't have gotten into the wrong hands." Thomas stood. "You mean mine?" Martin lowered his voice. "You don't know what you're dealing with, little brother. These developers, they're not sentimental. They don't care about your campfire stories or old maps. They'll bury you with your blueprints." Thomas leaned in, steady and quiet. "Then tell them to bring a shovel." That night back at Nora's, Pete returned with a weathered folder sealed in plastic. Inside were the missing water protection filings, signed, dated, and backed by tribal council acknowledgement. Ayana nearly cried when she saw them. Thomas stared at the old papers, his father's handwriting, a silent prayer etched into government forms. "They buried this," Pete said. "But they didn't burn it. That's the difference." Thomas nodded slowly, heart thudding with the rhythm of something awakening. "We bring it to the judge," he said. "And if he sees what we see, maybe he'll finally stop the bulldozers." Ayana stepped closer. "And if he doesn't," Thomas looked out the window toward the black stretch of night swallowing the hills. "Then we stop them ourselves. We are not protesters, we are protectors. And this land doesn't need saving. It needs remembering." The sunrise crawled slowly across the red ridges that towered over the mesa, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led to the drill site. Thomas tightened the straps of his father's old satchel, the water rights documents secured inside like a heartbeat. Ayana stood beside him in silence. Her fingers curled around a walkie-talkie, her eyes on the horizon. Pete's truck idled behind them, full of boxes, photocopies of affidavits, laminated maps, signed witness statements. Judge Stone agreed to the emergency hearing. Ayana said, her voice low and bracing. 3 o'clock, downtown courthouse. Thomas nodded once. "We don't have until 3. Bulldozers are scheduled for 10. Ayana didn't argue. She just lifted her hand and pressed the button on the walkie. Time to roll. From both ends of the dusty road, trucks and vans began to appear, elders, ranchers, students from the tribal college, even tourists who had heard whispers about something real happening in Red Mesa. They came carrying banners, drums, folding chairs, coffee thermoses, and firewood. At the center of the road, just beyond the ridge, the steel skeleton of Red Mesa Holdings' drill rig pierced the sky, casting its greedy shadow across the ancestral grazing lands. Thomas walked forward until the rig came into full view. Workers in high-vis vests paused, some uncertain, others frowning behind sunglasses. Then a white truck with tinted windows pulled up and stopped. Martin stepped out wearing a blazer like he was attending a business lunch. He took off his sunglasses and glanced at the crowd gathering behind Thomas. "This is trespassing." Thomas stepped forward. "No, this is home." Martin's jaw tightened. "You don't have jurisdiction here. The permits were filed. The company has rights." Thomas pulled the folded map from his satchel and held it out. "These are my father's filings, recognized by tribal council, protected water zones. Red Mesa doesn't have clearance." Martin glanced at the paper, then gave a slight smirk. "That's not going to hold up in court. It doesn't have to. Not yet." Thomas turned and raised his voice so everyone could hear. "They told us we didn't own this. But this land doesn't belong to paper. It belongs to memory, and memory is what brought us back. Ayana stepped beside him, unfurling a handmade banner that read, "We are not protesters. We are protectors." The drumming began slowly, just one elder with a skin drum, his hands patient, his rhythm steady. Others joined. The sound rose like thunder from the ground itself. Nora handed out sage bundles. Children held drawings of wild horses and cornfields. A few young men from the community set up a line of tents across the access road. Martin looked at the gathering, suddenly less smug. "You're not going to stop this with singing and signs." Pete moved beside Thomas, holding his phone up. "You sure? Because the press is on its way. And I'm live streaming this to over 2,000 people as we speak." Martin looked at the camera and adjusted his collar. Then, a white SUV with tribal plates pulled up, and out stepped Councilwoman Lita Begay, wearing her silver squash blossom necklace like armor. She walked directly to Thomas. "You have my attention, Mr. Yazzie." Thomas handed her the original filings. "My father protected this land for decades. It was forgotten, misplaced, maybe even buried. But it's real. And if we lose it, we don't just lose grazing fields, we lose ceremony, identity, and truth." Councilwoman Begay looked over the documents, then turned to Martin. "Until we verify the legitimacy of these filings, I'm placing a temporary stay on all drilling operations on tribal lands. Red Mesa Holdings must stand down." Martin stepped back like he'd been slapped. "You can't do that unilaterally." "I just did," she replied. "And if you'd like to appeal, you're welcome to sit through the council's next open session scheduled for 3 weeks from now." Cheers erupted. Drums pounded louder. For a moment, the rising sun warmed Thomas's shoulders, like his father's hand, steady and proud. But it wasn't over. Ayana touched his arm. "We still have to face the judge." Thomas nodded. "Then we do both. We guard the line and we show up in that courtroom." Nora stepped forward. "I'll stay here with the elders. We've got tents, food, water. We're not moving." Thomas looked at her, gratitude swelling. "Thank you. You're not alone anymore, Thomas. That's the whole point." He turned to Pete. "Let's get to town." The ride into the courthouse felt both slow and urgent. Thomas sat in the back seat rereading the papers they had gathered: water rights, grazing zones, environmental risk assessments. Every page held not just evidence, but echoes of his father's handwriting, of stories passed around the fire, of fences walked and rocks marked by hand. At the courthouse steps, the trio paused. "You ready for this?" Pete asked. Thomas squared his shoulders. "No, but I'm here." Inside, Judge Stone sat behind a high bench, a silver-haired man with a face carved by decades of listening. The courtroom was nearly full, Red Mesa Holdings lawyers on one side, tribal officials and local residents on the other. Martin sat at the front, arms crossed, gaze hard. Thomas took the stand and presented their case. He spoke not with polish, but with truth about his father's forgotten filings, the hidden documents, the water protections never honored. Ayana supported him with maps and digital overlays. Pete handled the legalese. Martin's lawyers tried to argue improper filing. They brought up Thomas's absence from the reservation, tried to paint him as a troublemaker. But every time they struck someone from the back, stood up an elder, a rancher, a neighbor, and reminded the court that the land remembered what paper forgot. Judge Stone leaned back in his chair after 2 hours of testimony. "I'm not here to make final decisions about long-term ownership, but I have seen enough to grant a preliminary injunction against Red Mesa Holdings. No development shall proceed until further review by both this court and the tribal council." A rush of breath filled the room. Thomas felt Ayana's hand find his. As they stepped out into the light, Pete clapped Thomas on the back. "You bought time." Thomas looked up at the sky. "Time's only worth something if we use it." Back at the mesa, fires were burning the air rich with sage and song. Children ran barefoot across the dusty field, laughter peeling into the dusk. The rig stood still, untouched, its shadow retreating inch by inch as the sun sank behind the ridge. Thomas stood among his people, no longer the quiet son of a buried man. He wasn't his father, but he was his father's echo. And that was enough. For now. They buried the truth beneath contracts and concrete, but the earth still remembers, and so do we. Night settled over Red Mesa like a blanket worn by time. The fires at the blockade burned low, but no one left. The rhythm of drums had softened into murmurs, and stories passed between elders and youth braided into the wind like old songs rediscovered. Thomas stood near the largest tent, speaking quietly with Councilwoman Begay. The council's support had shifted the tide, but the battle was far from over. "I'm authorizing a full review of Red Mesa Holdings' dealings with the Bureau of Land Management," she said, folding her arms as if bracing against more than just the chill in the air. "There's talk that some of the permits they used aren't just shaky, they may have been falsified." Thomas tightened his grip on the folded papers in his hands. "We need to prove it. Not just suspicion, evidence." Begay nodded. "That's the only thing that will hold in federal court." Ayana joined them, her tablet glowing faintly in her hands. "There's a trail," she said. "I've been digging into their filings. Some documents reference environmental impact assessments that don't exist. Others show forged signatures from inspectors who haven't worked in this region for years." Thomas looked from her to Begay. "We need access to everything. Internal memos, communications with subcontractors. If there's corruption buried in their operation, we bring it into the light." Begay tilted her chin. "Then you'll want to talk to Marla Quintero. She used to work for Red Mesa Holdings in their legal compliance department. She was quietly let go last year." Thomas frowned. Why, she asked too many questions. Later that night, in a small adobe house at the edge of Chinle, Thomas and Ayana sat across from Marla at her kitchen table. Her face was lined with weariness, but her eyes burned with quiet anger. "I knew what they were doing wasn't right," she said. "They came into this land with one goal: profit. They didn't care what they had to ignore or falsify to get it. When I started flagging discrepancies, they told me to be a team player." Thomas leaned in. "Do you still have access to any files I made?" "Copies," she said. "I didn't trust them. I didn't know why I kept them until now." She stood, disappeared into the next room, and returned with a flash drive. "Everything's on here. Emails, scanned letters, permit amendments with mismatched dates." Ayana took the drive and plugged it into her tablet. Her eyes flicked across the screen, growing wider with every scroll. There are internal memos approving drilling despite known water contamination risks. Marla nodded. They ran tests and ignored the results. Doctored them before submitting the reports to the state. They even listed tribal lands as uninhabited buffer zones in some of the filings. Thomas's jaw locked. This is enough to bury them." Marla reached out and touched his wrist. "No, it's enough to reveal them. They buried the truth beneath contracts and concrete, but the earth still remembers, and so do we." They left Marla's home just after midnight, the flash drive clutched like sacred fire. Pete was waiting by the truck. Well, he asked. Thomas didn't speak. He just held up the drive. Back at the encampment under the stars, Ayana projected the documents onto a canvas stretched between two poles. One by one, community members watched the names, dates, and evidence appear. Nora wept openly. Elders sat in silence, heads bowed not in defeat, but in reverence for the ancestors who had guarded the land before them and for the warriors now standing in their stead. "This isn't just about drilling," Thomas said, his voice carrying into the stillness. "It's about a legacy of erasure. We were never meant to find these papers. We weren't supposed to remember these lands as sacred. But we do. And now the world will too." Pete stepped forward. "We send this to every news outlet that will listen. We share it with the State Environmental Board, with federal investigators. We turn their silence into headlines." Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. Regional news stations showed up with cameras and questions. Independent journalists began live streaming from the encampment. Hashtags trended. The Red Mesa resistance became more than a local standoff, it became a symbol. One morning, as Thomas walked to the ridge to speak with some newly arrived supporters, he saw 3 black SUVs roll up to the site's edge. Men in suits emerged, carrying clipboards and wearing grim expressions. "Federal agents. They're from the Department of the Interior," Pete said, coming up behind him. "And the EPA." The story worked. The agents requested a full briefing. Thomas, Ayana, and Pete presented the evidence step by step. Marla arrived later that afternoon to offer sworn testimony. The agents took statements, photos, copies of every document. "We'll begin an official investigation immediately," one of them said. "Your cooperation is appreciated." But the tension didn't lift. That night, someone set fire to one of the outer tents. No one was hurt, but it sent a clear message. "They're desperate," Nora whispered. "They're cornered." Thomas stared into the embers. "That makes them dangerous." Ayana stood close beside him. "We don't back down." "Not ever," he replied. But he knew they had to do more than resist. They had to rebuild trust in the land's protection layer by layer. And that would mean looking deeper than oil wells and permits. It would mean understanding the roots of betrayal, even the ones hidden in their own history. As the firelight danced against the stone walls, Thomas thought of his father's journal still locked in the old wooden box beneath his trailer floor. He had read the water maps, the surveys, but there were other entries, half-finished thoughts, names he didn't recognize. And one phrase that stood out now more than ever: "The land will reveal what memory alone cannot." He would have to go back to the source, back to the beginning, to his father's final journey across the southern ridge. And maybe, just maybe, there he would find what they all needed next. "My father didn't leave me a legacy of land, he left me a path through silence, and I finally understand where it leads." The morning came heavy with dust and silence. Thomas stood alone beside the half-buried box he'd unearthed from beneath his trailer, his father's last gift, sealed in cracked wood and faded brass hinges. He opened it slowly, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what it might reveal. Inside, among maps and worn field notebooks, lay a folded leather pouch, stitched with a pattern Thomas had only seen once on the blanket his father was buried in. He opened the pouch and pulled out its contents: a compass, a carved stone pendant, and a brittle sheet of paper, yellowed and curled. On it, his father had written a single line at the top in dark pencil: "If the land is silenced, follow the veins beneath." Below it was a hand-drawn map, more detailed than anything Thomas had seen. Not of oil plots or survey lines, but of water tables, fault lines, and a forgotten underground stream that ran from the southern ridge to the sacred basin. Thomas traced the route with his finger, recalling the old stories his father once whispered under stars about hidden springs and caves where water sang in the dark. He had thought they were just bedtime legends. Now they felt like prophecy. He gathered the map and Pouch slipped them into his satchel and started the drive out toward the southern ridge. Pete met him at the base, eyes squinting under his hat. "You're sure about this?" Pete asked already, shouldering a coil of rope and a flashlight. "My father didn't leave me a legacy of land," Thomas said, staring up at the rugged rise. "He left me a path through silence, and I finally understand where it leads." They climbed in slow silence, the sun baking the red sandstone around them. The map had led them to an overgrown arroyo Thomas barely remembered from childhood hikes. As they descended into the gulch, they found a fissure in the rock wall, narrow but passable. Inside, the air turned cool and damp. The flashlight beams bounced off limestone streaked with mineral veins, the walls whispering with faint echoes. They walked for nearly an hour until the tunnel opened into a cavern glittering with crystals and the distant sound of trickling water. At its center, a small underground spring gurgled from the rocks, feeding a narrow stream that disappeared into the darkness beyond. Pete knelt beside the pool and touched the water, cold, fresh, untapped. Thomas unrolled his father's map again and laid it on a dry rock. He compared it to the cavern's features. Everything matched. His father had known. "They drilled blind," Thomas murmured. "If they'd gone deeper, they'd have poisoned this whole basin." Pete's face tightened. "But this changes everything. If we get hydrologists out here, if we prove this spring feeds the entire watershed, then Red Mesa Holdings won't just face fraud charges. They'll be responsible for threatening a federally protected aquifer." They took photographs, samples, and GPS coordinates. By the time they emerged into the afternoon sun, a storm was building over the plains. Thunder rolled in the distance like the earth clearing its throat. Back at camp, Ayanna examined the samples under her field testing kit. "It's pristine," she said. "Zero contaminants. And this mineral balance matches the readings from the Sacred Basin Springs. This stream feeds the whole valley." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we use it. This is how we stop them." Word spread fast. Councilwoman Begay contacted a hydrology team at the university in Flagstaff. By the next morning, a team of scientists arrived and descended into the cavern with Thomas. Their preliminary findings confirmed it. The spring was a major, undocumented source of water for the region, and drilling within 5 miles would endanger it irreparably. The report was filed with the Department of the Interior, and a cease and desist order followed within 48 hours. Red Mesa Holdings was ordered to suspend all operations pending a full environmental impact review. But the silence that followed wasn't relief, it was awaiting breath. That night, Thomas sat by the fire as children played near the drums, and elders shared quiet stories in Dine Bizad. Ayanna sat beside him, watching the stars emerge. "Your father protected that spring his whole life," she said. "He died before he could stop them, but he made sure you could. That's a legacy, too." Thomas held the pendant from the pouch between his fingers, rubbing the smoothed stone etched with the curve of a wave. "He taught me the land has memory," he said softly. "But I didn't know he meant it literally." Ayanna touched his arm. "What we remember, we protect." Lightning flashed far in the distance, lighting the cliffs like ghosts dancing. Thomas stared at it, a slow fire building behind his eyes. "We've got truth. We've got the law. But that won't stop people who don't care about either." "They'll come at us harder now," Pete said, joining them with a radio in his hand. I picked up chatter on the emergency band. "They're lobbying for federal override. Some of their allies in D.C. want to reclassify the land as non-protected territory." Thomas stood slowly. "Then we don't just prove the land matters. We prove it's ours." Nora joined them, then her voice calm and rooted. "The old stories speak of land being taken again and again. but they also speak of people standing when the wind rises, when the drums call. You're not alone, Thomas. He looked around at the camp. What began as a few tents had grown into a village. Solar panels lined one side. Medical tents stood next to communal kitchens. Children were learning the language again, scrawling DNA characters on slates. This wasn't just a blockade, it was rebirth. And now, with the spring beneath them, they had a heart. We finish what he started, Thomas said. Not with fists, with roots, with water, with truth. The fire crackled, casting sparks upward like embers of a long-forgotten promise. The people leaned in, the land listened, and Thomas knew they were closer now than they'd ever been. But the final storm hadn't arrived yet, and he could feel it gathering. You can't erase people by redrawing lines on a map. Our stories are older than your borders. The wind had shifted by dawn. It came sharp off the mesa, carrying with it a different kind of warning. Not the quiet, sacred kind that whispered from stone and root, but a louder, more manufactured tension that clung to the air like barbed wire. Thomas stood at the edge of the camp, scanning the dusty road below. 3 black SUVs were making their slow crawl toward the barricade. Behind them trailed a convoy of government trucks, survey vans, tactical units, and one ominous white vehicle stamped with the Department of Energy's seal. "They're early," Pete muttered, adjusting his hat. "They're trying to surprise us," Thomas said. "But this isn't a fight that started yesterday." Ayanna joined them, face calm, voice steel. Councilwoman Begay said they'd push for emergency jurisdiction, fast-track reclassification. They want the land declared federal utility reserve. Thomas clenched his jaw. So they're hoping to redraw a line and call it legal. The first SUV stopped at the barricade, 3 logs chained together and flanked by handmade signs. "This land remembers, water is sacred, you can't drink oil." A man in a gray suit stepped out, adjusting his collar, like the desert heat was an inconvenience rather than a force. Behind him, 2 uniformed agents emerged, scanning the camp with calculated detachment. "I'm Director Allen," the man announced, not bothering to wait for an invitation. "We're here under federal authority to conduct a site reassessment. Please clear the barricade." "No one called you here," Thomas replied, unmoved. "And no one's moving anything." Allen's eyes narrowed. "There's been a jurisdictional review. This land's status is under federal dispute pending transfer of stewardship. That means our presence is authorized." Pete stepped forward. "This land isn't disputed. It's been occupied, cultivated, and protected by our people for centuries. You don't get to erase that with paperwork." Allen offered a tight, thin smile. "History is not ownership." Thomas took a step closer, holding up a folder. "Then maybe facts are. These are hydrology reports from independent scientists. The spring beneath this ridge feeds the entire basin. If you drill here, you contaminate the water table for over 3 counties." Allen didn't take the folder. "The department has its own experts. You brought armed guards, not geologists," Ayanna said coldly. Allen turned to her. "And you are someone whose people have outlived every empire that's tried to forget them." The agents stiffened. Allen waved them down. "We're not here to make arrests today, but obstruction of a federal investigation is a felony." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then slowly walked toward the barricade. Around them, dozens of tribal members stood quietly, arms folded, children, holding on to their mothers, elders watching from the shadows of tents. Thomas stepped over the chain and stood in front of Allen, boots planted in the dirt. "You can't erase people by redrawing lines on a map," he said. "Our stories are older than your borders." Allen didn't answer. He simply nodded at the agents. They moved past the barricade cameras recording, as if presence alone gave permission. But the people didn't move. The agents walked into the camp, stepping around cook fires and canvas dwellings, recording with cold, mechanical eyes. One pointed toward the ridge. "That's where the spring is rumored to be," he said. "We'll mark coordinates for review. They're not rumors Ayanna called after them. They're facts, documented and peer-reviewed." Alan turned eyes scanning her. "This isn't about facts. It's about jurisdiction." "That's what colonizers always say," Nora murmured from the circle of elders. The government convoy stayed the afternoon circling the ridge, photographing, measuring, never touching, but always threatening to. They didn't ask permission. They didn't offer respect. They simply collected and left like vultures with briefcases. When the last van disappeared down the road, the air in the camp hung heavy. "They're going to try to claim the spring belongs to the state," Pete said. "They'll argue it's a strategic resource." Thomas nodded. "We need to move faster. We file an injunction before they can reclassify the land. And we file for cultural protection status for the cavern." "That'll take weeks," Ayanna said. "They could bring drill rigs tomorrow." "Then we stay here," Thomas said. "On the ridge. If they want to touch that land, they'll have to go through us." That night they moved the camp, higher tents and solar rigs hauled up by handstones, laid in prayer lines, watchers posted along the perimeter. The spring's cavern became the heart of their vigil. They lit sacred fires at the entrance and sang songs that hadn't been heard in generations. And they sent out the call across the res, across state lines, to every community that had ever fought a pipeline or a land theft. The next morning, more people arrived. Cars lined the edge of the plateau. Banners flew in Navajo, Lakota, Apache, Hopi. Drums beat across the stone. And Thomas stood at the center, feeling for the first time that the land beneath him was no longer a wound, but a voice. "They think this is just about oil," he said quietly to Ayanna. "But this is about remembering who we are when they try to make us forget." She looked toward the horizon where the government trucks had gone, and who will still be long after they're gone. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't feel like warning. It felt like breath, like a storm that would cleanse, not destroy. They were not guests here. They were the land's memory come alive again, and they weren't leaving. Some truths aren't secrets. They're seeds. The camp had changed its shape. What once felt like a defensive line had softened into something, living rows of tents now arranged in a wide circle, paths, worn smooth by footsteps, cooking fires set with intention rather than urgency. The ridge no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a gathering place. Thomas noticed it first in the mornings. Children woke early and ran toward the spring with tin cups, laughing, as if water had never been something that could be taken. Elders sat on folding chairs facing the sunrise, murmuring prayers in Diné Bizad, voices low and steady. Volunteers from neighboring tribes helped repair wind-battered tents, shared food, taught songs. Resistance had turned into community. Ayanna stood near the makeshift bulletin board they'd built from scrap plywood, pinning up the latest court filings and environmental notices. She had grown into the role without anyone asking her to. People came to her with questions, and she answered calmly, clearly, never raising her voice. Thomas watched her from a distance, a quiet ache in his chest, pride braided with the memory of her mother, whose steady hands and gentle authority he saw now in their daughter. Pete approached, carrying a folded newspaper. "You're on the front page again." Thomas didn't reach for it. "Good or bad?" Pete smiled thinly. "Depends who's reading. The headline says, 'Tribal Coalition Forces Federal Review of Red Mesa Permits.' Subheading mentions the spring. Mentions you." Thomas exhaled slowly. "I never wanted my name attached to this." "I know," Pete said. "But movements need faces, even when the face would rather stay in the shade." Across the camp, Councilwoman Begay was speaking with a group of journalists, her posture calm but unyielding. She gestured toward the ridge, toward the land, not once toward Thomas. That more than anything told him things were shifting. Later that afternoon, a caravan of cars arrived. Artists, teachers, veterans, families who had driven hours after hearing about the encampment. Among them was a woman Thomas didn't recognize at first. Tall, sun-browned, carrying a canvas portfolio under one arm. She approached Ayanna first. "I'm Lila Moreno," she said. "I teach art in Gallup. My students wanted to come, but I told them I'd bring something instead." She opened the portfolio and pulled out a painting. It stopped Thomas in his tracks. The image was simple but heavy with meaning, a rusted tackle box resting beside a clear pool of water, its lid slightly open. From inside, instead of hooks or lures, roots spilled outward, thick living roots that wrapped around stones-fed saplings, held the earth together. Above it, painted in soft, hand-lettered words, were the lines, "What was hidden was never lost. It was waiting to grow." Ayanna's breath caught. That's exactly it. Lila smiled. "Your story is already teaching people. You don't have to shout for it to spread." By evening, more art appeared. Chalk drawings on flat stones, poems taped to tent poles, songs shared around fires, stories told not as accusations, but as offerings. Thomas sat with Ethel Begay as the sun dipped low, the sky bruised purple and gold. "You see what's happening?" she asked. "I do," he said quietly. "This is how truth survives," she said, "not by being locked away, by being carried." That night, Thomas was asked to speak. He resisted at first. He had never been comfortable with words meant for crowds. But Ayanna squeezed his hand once, just once, and he stood. The circle grew quiet. "I didn't plan this," Thomas began. "I didn't wake up one day wanting to lead anything. I was just trying to understand why my father left me what he did." He paused, eyes scanning the faces, familiar, unfamiliar, all listening. "I thought he left me silence. I thought he left me something small and forgotten. But I was wrong. He left me responsibility. And he trusted me to figure out what it was for." He gestured toward the ridge. "This land doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to any company or agency. It belongs to the stories that shaped it, and to the people who refuse to forget those stories." A murmur of agreement rippled through the circle. "I won't pretend this is over," he continued. "There are still papers being signed somewhere far from here. Still people who think they can wait us out. But they don't understand something." He looked at the children playing near the fire, at the elders leaning together, at Ayanna standing steady at his side. "Some truths aren't secrets," he said. "They're seeds. And once they're planted, you don't get to decide how far they grow." Silence followed, not empty but full. Afterward, as the fires burned low, Pete brought him a folded document. "Federal Review Board just issued a preliminary finding," he said. "They're recommending permanent suspension of Red Mesa's permits pending a full cultural and environmental assessment." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "That's not the end," Pete added. "But it's a turning point." Later, Thomas walked alone to the edge of the ridge, the spring murmuring softly behind him. The land felt different beneath his boots, not fragile, not threatened, but awake. He took out the old pendant his father had left him and pressed it into the dirt just for a moment, like a promise returned. Behind him, Ayanna approached. "They're asking about next steps," she said gently. "About what happens after." Thomas smiled, tired but clear-eyed. "After isn't something we rush into." She nodded. "But you're thinking about it." "I am." Below them, the camp glowed with soft light. People moved easily, not guarding anymore, just being. We didn't just stop something, Thomas said. We started something. Ayana leaned against him, her head resting briefly on his shoulder. That's usually how it works. You just don't see it at first. The wind moved through the grass, carrying laughter, prayer, the sound of water. Thomas looked out across the land. His father had loved the land that had remembered. And for the first time since the will was read, since the tackle box was lifted from dust and doubt, he felt not like a man standing in the way of loss, but like someone standing at the edge of something enduring, something that would outlive him, and that he knew was the point. Healing isn't a return, it's a becoming. Thomas woke before the sun, not to prepare, not to guard, not even out of habit, but because something inside him stirred quietly, like a drumbeat on the edge of sleep. The camp, once a reaction, now moved on its own rhythm. He stood outside his tent, feeling the frost kiss his face, the sky barely tinged with morning. In the distance, smoke curled from cook fires. Someone was singing, a woman's voice, low and haunting, moving between Dene and English, like it was weaving something whole. He walked slowly toward the gathering circle where the morning meal was already being laid out. Fry bread, stewed beans, hot coffee poured into mismatched mugs. The air smelled of cedar and cornmeal. Across the fire, Ayana was laughing with Lila Moreno and a young woman from Hopi who had brought a loom to teach the children weaving. The sight caught him, not just for the beauty of it, but for the ease. The ease was new. Ethel Begay waved him over. "They're calling a final meeting," she said, handing him a folded note. "Representatives from the Interior Department, EPA, and the Tribal Coalition. It's all coming to a head." Thomas nodded. When noon, at the circle, he glanced toward the ridge, still quiet, still watching them. "Is Red Mesa sending anyone? Not directly. Their lawyers will be on the line." He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket. "Then we meet on our own terms." By midday, the circle had filled. Not just with camp members, but with allies from towns, pueblos, and neighboring tribal nations. Dene, Zuni, Hopi, Apache. Old and young. A few elders wore ribbon shirts and silver necklaces. Others came in denim and wool, their presence more powerful than attire. Councilwoman Begay stood, her voice strong. "We recognize the federal representatives and thank those willing to listen. But today's outcome won't be determined by signatures or press statements. It will be determined by truth." She stepped back. All eyes turned to Thomas. He rose not as a leader, not as a warrior, but as someone who had listened long enough to speak. "When I first came to this land, I didn't come with answers," he began. "I came with grief. I came thinking I was the last leaf on a branch that had withered." He looked out across the gathered faces, but the land had been listening longer than I had, and it remembered. He held up a packet documents they'd compiled with the legal team, environmental surveys, oral histories, transcribed and translated. "We fought for what was visible, waterland burial sites. But what we truly defended was what can't be measured in feet or gallons." He turned to the EPA representative, a thin man in a pressed suit, whose face carried the weathered resignation of someone who had attended many of these hearings. "This isn't about adjusting a pipeline. It's about restoring something deeper." Ayana stepped forward beside him and opened a scroll, Lila's mural painted onto canvas, now carried from school to school, signed by hundreds of children across tribal communities. "This is what happens when you listen," Ayana said. "When you stop measuring value by what you can extract and start measuring it by what you can sustain." The officials listened. Some looked moved, some didn't, but none interrupted. At the end, Ethel Begay stood once more. "We're not asking," she said simply. "We are telling. This land is sacred. The permits are revoked. Not suspended. Revoked. If the law has not yet caught up to what is just then, it is the law that must evolve." There was no vote, only silence. A kind of sacred verdict passed, not by court, but by presence, and it held. The next days moved like a dream finally awake. A federal announcement confirmed what they demanded: full revocation of Red Mesa's drilling permits on the ridge. A long-term cultural conservation easement. No future developments without tribal council consent. But more than what was stopped, it was what started that mattered. A fund was established built from community donations and matched by environmental coalitions. It would support education storytelling projects, land stewardship internships for young tribal members. Thomas stood at the edge of the ridge days later watching as the last signs of the Red Mesa trucks disappeared from the horizon. Pete came and stood beside him, quiet for a moment. "You did it," he said. Thomas shook his head. "We did it." Pete smiled. "You're staying right. You're not vanishing back to the city." Thomas looked out over the land that had taught him everything he hadn't known he'd forgotten. "I think I was always meant to stay. I just had to remember why." Ayanna joined them, a thick notebook in her arms, sketches, notes, applications. "We're starting a community archive," she said, "with stories, songs, elder interviews. I want to house it here, at the spring." Thomas nodded, something in his chest settling. It's where everything began. Weeks passed. The camp became a permanent fixture, not in resistance, but in learning. A teaching lodge was raised, a solar water pump installed, trails marked with signs in both English and Diné Bizad, explaining sacred meanings. Children from nearby towns came on school buses. Grandmothers taught them how to grind corn with basalt stones. Grandfathers sat under cottonwoods and explained the constellations by memory, not textbook. The land had changed because the people had remembered how to speak to it. One evening, as the stars deepened, Thomas walked to the spring with the old tackle box, still dented, still heavy. He opened it beside the water. Inside were the same odd tools, the same worn papers, and one thing he hadn't seen before, a letter tucked beneath the false bottom. His father's handwriting. "Thomas, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've stayed longer than I thought you might. Good. The land doesn't reveal its secrets to the restless. I didn't give you much. I gave you something to protect. But more than that, I gave you a question to carry. If it stays with you long enough, it'll bloom into something better than answers. Be slow. Be brave. Be listening. Dad." Thomas folded the letter slowly, the ache in his chest soft and familiar like an old friend. He looked around, not just at the spring, but at the tents, the classrooms, the gathering circle. Healing wasn't a return. It was a becoming. And the land was becoming something new again, through them, with them, because of what they chose to remember and what they chose to leave behind. Ayanna called to him from the trail. Dinner was ready. Children were dancing near the fire. He stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and walked toward the light. The educational lesson learned from this story is that healing often comes not from returning to what was, but from embracing who we become when we choose to listen, act, and grow with purpose. Even in later years, standing up for what is right and honoring what truly matters, heritage, community, and the land can leave a legacy far greater than any material wealth. It's never too late to rediscover your roots or to make peace with the past by investing in the future. Small, steady acts of courage can ripple out and restore what once felt lost.